The monitor flatlined at 11:47 p.m. 1 second it was fighting, that jagged, desperate line climbing and falling and climbing again, and then it simply stopped. A single flat tone filled the ICU and the surgical team froze for exactly half a second, which is how long it takes the human body to process the sound of a life ending, before the lead surgeon called for the paddles and everything moved at once. 다시 한번. One more time. The paddles hit Hanul's chest. His body lifted off the table. Fell back. The line stayed flat. 다시. Again. The second shock. Again his body lifted, again it fell, and the monitor gave them 3 seconds of something. A weak, stuttering signal. A heart trying to remember what it was supposed to do. And then that too went quiet and the line went flat and the sound of it filled the room like water filling a room. Slow and total and inevitable. The lead surgeon, a man who had been in this room more times than any person should be, straightened. He pulled down his mask. He looked at the clock on the wall. He looked at it for 3 full seconds, as if confirming something he did not want to confirm. 사망 시각, he said. 23시 47분. Time of death. 11:47 p.m. He said it for the record. He said it clearly, loudly, so that the nurse writing on the clipboard at the door could hear it and write it down and make it official in all the ways that a death needs to be made official. He said it and the room accepted it and the machines were turned off one by one and the sound of the ICU changed completely, from urgent to empty, from fighting to finished. And then, very quietly, in the left breast pocket of his surgical coat, his phone vibrated. He did not reach for it. He turned back to the table. He looked at Hanul, at the stillness of him, at the sword-wound, dressed and sutured, at the face that had given nothing away in life and was giving nothing away now. He looked at him for 4 seconds. Then he said, louder, with more finality for the record. 사망이 확인되었습니다. Death confirmed. He turned and walked out of the room. In the corridor, away from the clipboard nurse and the remaining team and the official record of everything, he took his phone from his pocket. He read the message. He typed 2 words back. He put the phone away. He kept walking. Nobody noticed. Nobody was watching the surgeon. Everyone was watching the door to the waiting area, where the news was about to travel faster than anyone intended. Rachel was standing in the corridor with her daughter in her arms when she heard it. She did not hear words. She heard the quality of the sound, the register of grief in the voice of the nurse who came through the doors, the specific frequency that grief produces when it is real and immediate and has not yet been managed into something presentable. Her body understood it before her mind did. Her knees buckled. Junhai was beside her and his arms were around her before she reached the floor, and she was making a sound she had never made before in her life, something below crying, something below screaming, something from a place in her chest she had not known existed until the exact moment it tore open. 아니, she said. No. In Korean, which she had been learning for 3 years, which she had been learning because she was raising a child in Seoul, because she intended to stay, because she had built a life here and she was not leaving it. 아니야. No. That is not right. That cannot be right. Her daughter was still in her arms. The baby, weeks old, impossibly small, already with his jaw and her eyes in some combination that Rachel had been cataloging obsessively in the quiet moments when the rest of the world went still, looked up at Rachel's face with the pure, uncomprehending focus of something brand new to the world. She did not understand grief. She was not old enough to understand grief. She simply looked at her mother's face and Rachel looked back at her, and that was the moment the tears came, not from the announcement, not from the sound of the nurse's voice, but from looking at this child and understanding all at once and completely that she was going to have to raise her without him. She cried for the man who caught a blade barehanded, so it wouldn't touch her. She cried for the BMW in the rain, and the way he had driven through Seoul with her arms around him, and the rain soaking everything and the city blurring past in neon and her face pressed against his jacket. She cried for the first aid kit and the way he had stared at her face while she wrapped his palm like he had never in his life been looked at that way. She cried for "I'm sorry, my love," which was the first true thing he had ever said to her and the last thing he would ever say to anyone. Junhai held her. He held her and he looked over her head at the closed ICU doors, and his face did something complicated and then went very, very still. Because he knew. He knew what Rachel didn't know. He knew what the nurse didn't know. He knew what the entire hospital corridor, currently arranging itself around the fact of a death, didn't know, that somewhere in this building, in a basement corridor far from the official noise of the ICU, a different kind of arrangement was already in motion. Quietly. Efficiently. Without ceremony or documentation. He held Rachel and let her cry and said nothing and was the worst kind of person, which is not the kind who does harm but the kind who stands in the rubble of harm they allowed and holds the person the harm destroyed and tells themselves the holding is enough. It was not enough. He knew that. He held her anyway. In the basement of the hospital, wheels moved on concrete. A gurney. Two men in clothing that was close enough to medical to pass a quick glance but belonged to no department on any official staff list. Between them on the gurney, Hanul. Pale. Bandaged. The sword-wound dressed and sutured with the same precision the surgical team above had applied before the declaration, because the surgeon who had declared the time of death had also, in the 40 minutes of surgery before that declaration, done everything necessary to ensure the body on the gurney would survive the night. His chest rose. Fell. Rose. Fell. Shallow. Slow. The rhythm of someone not quite on the surface of consciousness. Someone suspended just below it, fighting upward through the dark of anesthesia and blood loss and the particular violence that had been done to his body. But rising. Consistently, stubbornly, against all reasonable expectation, rising. The service exit opened. Soul air hit the corridor. Cold. The kind of cold that soul produces in the hours after midnight, clean and indifferent and entirely without sympathy. The van was at the curb with its engine running and its windows blacked out. The men loaded the gurney. The doors closed. The van pulled into traffic. Soul received it without comment. Soul receives everything without comment. Cut to Yona's penthouse on the north side of the city. She was standing at the floor-to-ceiling glass in a silk nightgown, Soul spread out below her like something she had always owned, like the city had been built to be viewed from this precise window by this precise woman. She was not celebrating. She had never been a woman who celebrated. Celebration implied surprise, implied that the outcome had not been certain, and she had been certain about this outcome for a very long time. She simply stood in the stillness of a person who has arrived at the end of a very long plan and found it exactly where she left it. She almost smiled. Just slightly. Just once. The specific, private smile of a woman who decided she was going to win before anyone else understood the game had started. Behind her in the room, Hanul's new bed was already prepared. The machines were already set up. Her doctor, not the hospital surgeon, a different one, hers, loyal in the particular way that only a person with something to lose can be loyal, stood at the monitoring equipment with the focused confidence of someone who had been briefed thoroughly and paid accordingly. The van arrived. The transfer was made. Hanul was brought in and settled and connected to the machines, and Yona stood at the glass and did not turn around until she heard the confirmation, stable, and then she turned and she looked at him. Alive. Hers. She had loved him for 11 years in the only way she knew how, which was the way of a woman who had been taught that love and ownership were the same thing, that possession was a form of devotion, that keeping someone close by force was preferable to watching them choose to be somewhere else. She was aware, in some part of herself she rarely visited, that this was wrong. The part of herself she rarely visited was, accordingly, not visited often. She crossed to the bed. She stood over him. She looked at his face, the jaw, the tattoos, the long dark hair spread on the pillow, and she said very quietly, to no one in particular, to the room, "My now." She turned back to her doctor. "언제부터 시작할 수 있어요?" "When can we begin?" "내일 아침부터요." "Tomorrow morning." "오늘 밤부터 시작해요." "We begin tonight." The doctor did not argue. Nobody argued with Yona. They simply did what they were told and went home and tried not to think too carefully about what they had participated in. The medications were prepared. The conditioning protocol, developed over 18 months by a specialist Yona had found through channels that did not officially exist, was reviewed and approved. It would take time. Months, possibly. The human brain was not a machine. You could not simply overwrite it. You had to dismantle it gently and rebuild it in the shape you wanted, and this required patience and precision and the particular devotion of someone for whom the outcome was worth any length of wait. Yona had all three. She went back to the window. She stood there for a long time, soul below her, and she thought about Rachel Fizeo, about the bartender with the long straight hair and the first aid kit and the laugh that cost her nothing, and she felt, for one honest moment, the exact shape of what she had taken from her. Then she closed that part of herself and went to bed. 3 weeks later, the funeral was held. It was the kind of funeral that powerful families produce. Enormous, formal, choreographed to communicate a specific message about the person being mourned, which is that they were significant, that their absence is felt, that the world is smaller without them. The clan members stood in rows. The underworld attended in the way the underworld attends these things, silently, collectively, with the understanding that the man at the front of this ceremony could be any one of them on any given day, and that attendance is therefore both tribute and reminder. Rachel stood at the back. She had not been invited. She had not been informed. She had found out through Miho, Hanul's right-hand man, who had come to her apartment at 7 in the morning with his face doing the thing faces do when they are carrying news that cannot be made gentle, and he knew it, and she had dressed herself and her daughter and come anyway. She was in black. Her daughter, older now by 3 weeks, starting to have opinions about things, starting to produce expressions that stopped Rachel mid-breath because of who they reminded her of, was in her arms wrapped in white. The contradiction of it in this room. White in a sea of black, new life at a death ceremony, a child belonging to a man whose coffin was at the front of this room and who had never once gotten to know she existed. Junhai stood beside Rachel. He had come because she had come, and he did not intend to let her be in this room alone. He looked at the coffin and he kept his face controlled, and he did not look at Rachel because if he looked at Rachel he would have to either say something or leave, and he could do neither. Rachel looked at the coffin and she did not look away. She stood in the back of a room she had not been invited to, holding a child who deserved to know her father and would not, looking at the box that was supposed to contain the man she loved, and she said goodbye the only way she had ever known how, completely, without performance, without flinching, with her whole self turned toward the thing she was losing. Miho stood across the room. He looked at Rachel once. He looked at the coffin. He looked back at Rachel. Something moved through his face that he was careful to show no one. He knew things that the room did not know. He had known them for 3 weeks, and he had been weighing them every day since, turning them over in the part of himself where the heaviest decisions lived, trying to determine what the right thing was and finding, every time, that the right thing was also the most dangerous thing, and the most dangerous thing was the one that would cost him the most, and he was not yet ready to pay that cost. He looked at Rachel one more time. He looked at the child in her arms. He turned away. The ceremony ended. The room dispersed. Rachel walked out into Seoul with her daughter and Junhai at her side, and the cold air hit her face, and she kept walking because stopping was not an option. Because stopping meant standing still with everything she was carrying, and she was not yet ready for that. She would not be ready for a long time. 5 years is a long time to build a life on top of a grave. Rachel Fizeo had done it anyway, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was not something her body knew how to do, had never known how to do, had been specifically designed by every experience she had ever survived to be incapable of. She had packed grief into the part of herself where it could be carried without being visible, and she had gotten up every morning and made tea and gone to work and come home and fed her daughter and put her daughter to bed, and then sat in the kitchen alone in the quiet and let herself feel it for exactly as long as she could afford to before sleep took her under. This was how she had survived the first year. The second year was easier. Not because the grief was smaller, but because she had learned its shape well enough to move around it without hitting it in the dark. She knew where it lived. She knew which hours it preferred and which songs triggered it and which particular quality of Seoul evening light, low and golden and coming through the west-facing window at a specific angle around 5 p.m., would catch her without warning and send her back to a rainy night and a BMW and a man who had driven through the city like he was daring it to stop him. She did not let herself go there often. But on the evenings she did, she always came back. By the third year she had something she had not had since Lagos, a morning she looked forward to. Junhai made coffee at the same time every day, brought it to her before she asked for it, knew how she took it in winter versus how she took it in summer, knew which mornings required silence and which required conversation, and never confused the two. He had learned her the way you learn someone you intend to stay, slowly, without pressure, with the patient attention of a man who had decided she was worth the time it took to know her completely. She had fallen in love with him the way rivers find their direction, not in a single moment but through the gradual insistence of the current, the slow accumulation of mornings and conversations, and the specific safety of being with someone who never asked her to be different from what she was. She loved Junhai. She also still loved Hanul. She had made peace with the fact that these two things could be true simultaneously, because they were true simultaneously, and the world was not going to rearrange itself to make that easier for her, and Rachel Fizeo had never once asked the world to make anything easier for her. The morning that changed everything started like every other morning. Soul light through the penthouse glass. Warm, slow, the city beginning its day in the particular unhurried way the city begins its day when viewed from high enough above it. Junhai and Rachel in bed together in each other's arms, the ease of two people who have shared enough mornings to stop performing them. He was looking at her in the specific way he always looked at her, with the full, undivided attention of a man who had been given something he did not believe he deserved and had therefore never stopped being grateful for it. 그녀의 눈이 세상이야. Her eyes are the world. He had said it to her once, in Korean, on the balcony in the rain, 2 years into their life together, and she had asked him what it meant, and he had translated it and then been embarrassed by the translation, because some things only exist correctly in the language they were first thought in. She had not let him be embarrassed. She had kissed him instead. 내심장아, he said now, into the morning quiet. My heartbeat. 사랑해. I love you. She looked up at him. She had learned to be present in what she had. This was not the same as being over anything. It was simply the practice of choosing the life in front of you over the grief behind you, one morning at a time, until the practice became the life itself. 나도 사랑해, 자기야. I love you too, sweetheart. She kissed him. He held her closer. The morning held them both in the way mornings do when nothing has broken yet, when everything that is coming has not yet arrived. Then the bedroom door burst open with the force of something that had been preparing to burst for at least 3 minutes. Hayan, 5 years old and already the most alive person in any room she entered. She had her father's jaw, sharp and perfectly defined even at 5, the kind of jaw that would one day stop conversations, that already stopped Rachel sometimes when the light hit it at a certain angle. She had Rachel's eyes, deep and direct and carrying a quality of attention that made people feel seen when she turned them in their direction. She had the energy of both her parents combined and filtered through 5 years of a childhood that had been safe and loved and entirely unaware of the weight it was surrounded by. She was already in her school uniform, bag on her back, hair in 2 lopsided puffs that she had done herself, which meant one was higher than the other, and there was a clip in slightly the wrong place, and it was perfect in the specific way that only a 5-year-old's independent effort is perfect. 엄마. She shouted. Mommy. 아빠. 학교 늦겠어요. Daddy. I'm going to be late for school. She launched herself at the bed with the uncalibrated force of a child who has not yet learned that other people's bodies have limits, landing between them with an impact that made June-Hai grunt and made Rachel laugh, a full, real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere warm, and Hayan was already climbing over June-Hai's chest with the focused determination of someone who has places to be. 아빠, 제발요. Daddy, please. 늦는다고요. I'm going to be late. June-Hai caught her. He lifted her up against his chest and he held her there and he laughed. The full, unguarded laugh of a man who had not thought he would ever laugh like this again, who had spent 2 years after his wife and child died believing that this specific register of laughter had been permanently removed from his range, who had discovered, gradually and then completely, that it had simply been waiting for the right people. He held Hayan on his right arm and reached for Rachel with his left, and Rachel came to his side and leaned into him, and Hayan was between them, and all 3 of them were in this bed in this morning, and it was real, and it was theirs. He also knew things about her parentage that she did not know. He had been living with this knowledge for 5 years. On mornings like this one, Hayan in his arms, Rachel at his side, the city below them going about its business, the knowledge was the heaviest thing he carried. Heavier than the deal. Heavier than the secret. Heavier even than the guilt, which was considerable. Across the city, in a part of Seoul that did not appear in tourism photographs, a courtyard enclosed by high stone walls held a very different kind of mourning. Hanul was shirtless, 2 swords in his hands. 12 men arranged around him in the practiced configuration of opponents who had learned through repeated experience that the configuration did not matter, that whatever they arranged themselves into, whatever angle they came from, whatever strategy they arrived at between one session and the next, the outcome was not going to change. He was faster than they were. He was more precise than they were. He had been doing this since he was 14 years old, and the intervening 15 years had not made it harder, only cleaner. They came at him in pairs and he answered each pair with the minimal necessary response and moved on, and the courtyard processed their attempts and returned them, and when the last man was down, Hanul stood in the center of the stone space and breathed. On his abdomen, the scar. Long raised. The color of old silver in the morning light. It ran from the center of his stomach to his left side in the precise diagonal of a blade that had entered from the front and exited from the side. He had been told it was from a training accident. He believed this. He had no reason not to believe this. The medications ensured that he had no reason not to believe anything he had been told. His hair was different from how it had been. Shorter on the sides, a small ponytail tied back at the base of his skull, some of it falling forward across his jaw in the way it always fell. His face was slightly different too. The angles of it sharpened by the reconstruction Yona had commissioned in the 3rd month of his recovery, precise work that had made him both more and less recognizable depending on how well you had known him before. He was more handsome. He was also someone else. Both of these things were true, and only one of them was intentional. He stood in the courtyard and breathed and looked at nothing specific, and somewhere in the part of him that the medications had not fully reached, the part that lived below cognition and above instinct, the part that was neither memory nor reflex but something between the two. Something was moving. Looking for something. The way a compass needle moves in a field of interference, not finding north, but knowing north exists. Yona stepped into the courtyard. She was in a hanbok, deep blue, gold thread at the collar, the most deliberately composed version of herself that she produced for him every morning, because she understood that everything she had built depended entirely on what he saw when he looked at her, and she was not careless with anything that mattered. 다 끝났어, she said. All finished? 네, 이제. She went to him. She placed her hand on his chest over the scar, which she did every morning, a gesture she had built into the ritual of their constructed life together, because it was the gesture of a woman with nothing to hide and she needed him to read her as exactly that. He covered her hand with his. He kissed her. She smiled against his mouth. 안 먹었어, she said. Did you take your medication? 아직. Not yet. She produced the small white pill case from the pocket of her hanbok. She opened it. She held it out. He took the pill without looking at it, without examining it, without asking what it was or what it was for, because she had told him when it was introduced into the morning routine 18 months ago that it was for the headaches, the recurring headaches that had apparently plagued him since the training accident that left the scar. And he had accepted this without question because the medications ensured that he accepted things without question. He swallowed it. She watched him swallow it. She put the pill case back in her pocket. 샤워하고 나서 후회 있어, she said. Meeting after you shower. 이 선생 학교 건물 매입건. The Lee School property acquisition. He nodded. He went inside. She stood in the courtyard alone for a moment and looked at the stone and the sky and breathed the morning air and told herself what she always told herself at this hour, that this was the right choice, that the alternative had been unacceptable, that love was not wrong simply because the method of its keeping was unconventional. She almost believed it. Almost. She had been almost believing it for 5 years. She was very good at almost. Back across the city, the morning had moved on. Hayan had been collected, bag on back, clips slightly corrected, and delivered to her school in the good neighborhood that Junhai had chosen because Rachel wanted real grass in the playground and morning light in the corridors. Rachel had gone to the coffee shop she managed on Tuesdays and Thursdays, a small place, mismatched chairs, good music, the kind of customers who say thank you and mean it. She had built this too. It was hers too. Junhai was in the kitchen of the penthouse when his phone rang. He looked at the screen. The name on it made him go still in the specific way that some names made him go still, not with fear exactly, but with the specific alertness of someone who has learned that certain names on certain screens mean certain kinds of news. He answered. The voice on the other end was low and direct and identified itself in 3 words that told him everything he needed to know about why the call was coming now and what it was going to cost him. 이준혁. Junhai. 찾았어. Found them. Ryan. Hanul's uncle. The clan's second master. The man who had been running the Dragon Clan since the funeral. Running it with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing to run it his whole life while pretending to be content as second, which is the most exhausting and most necessary pretense in any hierarchy built on power. He had been looking for Hayan for 2 years. He had the patience of a man who understood that heirs do not disappear. They simply grow until they are old enough to be found. 무슨 뜻이에요? Junhai said. What do you mean? 내 말 이해했잖아. You understood me. 아이는 클랜 거야. The child belongs to the clan. Junhai looked at the kitchen window. Through its soul. Normal. Ordinary. The city that had no idea what was moving through it. 그 아이는 5살이에요. He said. That child is 5 years old. 알아. I know. 그래서 지금 연락하는 거야. Which is why I'm contacting you now. The line went quiet for a moment. 일주일 줄게. I will give you 1 week. Ryan's voice was not threatening. It was worse than threatening. It was certain. 그 다음엔 내가 직접 가. After that I come myself. The call ended. Junhai stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and looked at the counter where Rachel had been standing an hour ago with his arms around her, and the coffee brewing and the city below them going about its ordinary business. He looked at the space she had occupied. He thought about Hayan doing her hair herself this morning with the clip in the wrong place. He thought about what Ryan coming himself would look like. He put the phone in his pocket. He reached under the kitchen counter and checked the gun in the locked bracket. Still there. Still loaded. He stood up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with his eyes closed. Then an arrow came through the glass. It happened so fast that the sequence of events only assembled itself in retrospect. The crack of the window, the sound of the shaft stopping hard in the kitchen wall, the way the air in the room changed between one breath and the next. Junhai was already moving before the glass finished falling, already down, already putting the kitchen counter between himself and the window, already reaching for the gun. He came up in a crouch and swept the window line in the roof across the street and found nothing, no shooter visible, which told him this was not an attack but a message, which was in certain ways worse. He crossed to the arrow. He pulled it from the wall. He untied the paper from the shaft with hands that were steady because he had trained himself years ago to have steady hands in situations that did not warrant them. He read the paper. 피는 피로. Blood for blood. And at the bottom, drawn in ink with the specific, unmistakable geometry of a mark he had known since he was 22 years old, a dragon eating its own tail. He stood in the kitchen with glass on the floor and the arrow in his hand, and he looked at the mark for a long time. Then he heard Rachel's key in the door. He hid the arrow before she got through the door. Not because he had decided to lie to her, he had run out of that particular capacity somewhere around year 3, when the accumulated weight of what he was not saying had become so heavy that he had started telling her smaller truths to relieve the pressure, the way you release a valve before the whole system blows. He hid the arrow because he needed 20 minutes to think before he said anything, because Rachel Fizeo was the kind of woman who asked the exact right questions, and he needed to have the exact right answers before she started asking them, and right now he had none. She came in carrying a paper bag from the bakery 2 streets down. She always brought something home on Tuesday mornings, a habit she had built without noticing it was a habit, the small domestic rituals that accumulate into a life, and she set it on the kitchen counter and looked at the broken window and looked at June High, and her face did the thing it did when she was processing something she had not been prepared for. 창문이 왜 저래요? She said. What happened to the window? 새가 부딪혔어. A bird hit it. She looked at him. She looked at the window. She looked at the size of the hole in the glass, which was not, when examined, the size of a hole a bird would make, and she looked back at him. 무슨 새요? She said. What kind of bird? He said nothing. She waited. The silence between them was the specific silence of 2 people who have been together long enough for silence to carry its own full conversation, and this particular silence was saying things that neither of them were ready to say out loud yet. June High. Her voice was quiet. The quieter her voice got, the more it meant. He had learned this about her in year 1. 창문에 구멍이 났어. 새가 아니잖아. There is a hole in the glass. It was not a bird. He looked at her. He crossed to the kitchen counter. He reached behind the flour jar where he had put the arrow, folded, hidden. Evidence of a world she did not fully know was pressing on the edges of the life they had built, and he put it on the counter in front of her. She looked at the paper. She read it. Then she looked at the dragon at the bottom, and she went very still in the way. She only went still when something was genuinely serious rather than just frightening. 하네올의 삼촌이야. 준 하이세드. 한올's uncle. 류씨 클랜의 2번째 마스터. 하은이를 알고 있어. His name is Ryan. The clan's second master. He knows about Heian. Rachel said nothing for a moment. She was looking at the dragon on the paper. Then she put the paper down very carefully, the way you put something down when you do not trust yourself to be holding it, and she looked at June High, and her eyes were the eyes of a woman who has been afraid before and survived it and is assessing what this new fear is made of. 내 딸은 어떤 클랜에도 안 가. She said. My daughter does not go anywhere near any clan. 알아. I know. 그 사람 말이 맞든 틀리든. Whether that man believes he has a right or not. 알아. 레이첼. 그러면 우리가 뭘 해야 해? What do we do? He looked at her. He had been asking himself this question for the last 20 minutes and had arrived at an answer he didn't like and could not find an alternative to. He needed to go to Yona. Yona controlled Hanul. Hanul was the clan's master. Even declared dead, even officially mourned, the clan's internal structure recognized a living master over a declared one, and Ryan knew this, which was why he was coming now while the living master was still under Yona's control rather than anyone else's. One word from Hanul to Ryan and this ended. Yona could produce that word. The question was whether she would. 내가 처리할게, he said. I'll handle it. 오늘. Rachel looked at him for a long time with the eyes she had when she was deciding how much to trust an answer she was not sure was complete. Then she nodded. She picked up her paper bag from the bakery. She went to the kitchen and she started making breakfast because Rachel Fizeo's response to things she could not immediately control was to do the things she could control, the small, competent, ordinary things, and this had kept her functional through worse than this. June Hai watched her for a moment. Then he picked up his jacket and his keys and he left. Yona's building was on the north side of the city. He still knew the entry codes. She had never changed them, which he had always read as carelessness and now understood was something else. You only change the codes for people you are afraid of. Yona was not afraid of June Hai. She had calculated him thoroughly and determined that his love for Rachel was a leash and leashes could be held. She had not recalculated. She should have. He found her in the main room at her desk, looking at documents that she turned over when he came in, a habit, not a necessity. The reflex of a woman for whom information was currency and currency was always protected. 무슨 일이야? She said. What is it? 류씨가 하은이를 찾았어요. 준 하이 said. He put the arrow on her desk. He watched her look at it. He watched her read the paper and look at the dragon and put it down with the same careful deliberateness Rachel had used, which told him that both women understood exactly what it meant and were managing their responses to it in opposite directions for entirely different reasons. 그건 내 문제가 아니야. 연하 세드. That is not my problem. 한혜울이 클랜 마스터예요. 당신이 한혜울을 통제하잖아요. 그 사람한테 한마디만 하면 오늘 밤 끝나요. Hanul is the clan master. You control Hanul. One word from him to Ryan and this ends tonight. Yona looked at him with the patience of a woman who had been managing this situation for 5 years and found his urgency, while understandable, essentially irrelevant. 왜 내가 레이첼 피사요의 딸을 위해 한혜울을 써야 해? She said. Why would I use Hanul to protect Rachel Fizeo's child? 그 아이가 한혜울의 딸이니까요. Because that child is Hanul's daughter. 그래서 더욱더 안 되지. Which is exactly why I won't. Junhai looked at her. He looked at the woman who had built a cage around the most dangerous man in Seoul and filled it with manufactured memory and pharmaceutical compliance, and the specific cruelty of someone who loves without being capable of what love actually requires, and he thought about Haein doing her hair this morning with the clip in the wrong place. And he thought about what Ryan coming himself would look like for a 5-year-old girl who knew nothing about any of this. 루시가 직접 오면, he said, 막을 수 없어요. If Ryan comes himself, we cannot stop him. 그건 내 문제야, 진혁아. That is your problem, Junhai. He looked at her for a long time. She looked back. Then he picked up the arrow from her desk. He turned and he left. He sat in the car for 11 minutes. He did not start the engine. He sat with the arrow across his knees and he thought about all the choices that had led to this specific seat on this specific morning, and he traced them back one by one to their origins, and the origin of all of them was the same moment. The phone call in the hospital corridor, Yona's voice, the deal. He had made a deal that saved Haein and cost Hanul 5 years, and he had told himself it was love, and it was love, and it was also the most convenient thing he had ever done, and he had been trying not to look directly at that for 5 years and failing. He started the engine. He drove. But not back to the penthouse. He drove to the school first. He needed to see her. He needed to see Haein in her school uniform in the playground with the clip in the wrong place doing whatever 5-year-olds do at morning break. Needed the specific anchor of that image before he did what he had decided to do, because what he had decided to do was going to change everything, and he needed something real to hold on to while it was happening. He parked across the street from the school. He could see the playground through the gate, the children in their uniforms, the movement and noise of it, the particular beautiful chaos of small people encountering the world on their own terms for the first time. He found Haein. She was at the far end of the playground near the school bus gate, talking to a boy twice her size with the absolute authority of someone who has never once considered the possibility that she might not be listened to. He watched her for 3 minutes. Then he drove away. He did not see the black car parked 30 meters further down the street. He did not see Hanul in the back seat of it, documents in his hands from the meeting that had finished early, waiting for the driver to return from the building across the street where he had gone to collect a signature. Hanul was looking at the documents. Then he stopped looking at the documents. He had been looking at the documents, and then something in his peripheral vision had stopped him. Not a conscious noticing, but the body's noticing, the older and faster system that operates below thought and has its own priorities. He looked up. A girl at the far end of the playground. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at things he could not name, with the particular quality of attention that the medication had not managed to fully suppress, the frequency that moved through him in the presence of certain things and certain people without producing any information he could access consciously. She was talking to a boy twice her size, and the boy was clearly listening, and this did not surprise him somehow, looking at her, which was itself interesting. His driver returned. Got in. Started the engine. 잠깐만요. Wait a moment. His driver waited. The girl was now moving, away from the boy, toward the school bus gate, walking fast with the velocity of someone who has somewhere to be and is already calculating whether they are going to be late. The school bus was at the gate. The driver was checking his mirror. And from somewhere behind the girl, from the car park adjacent to the playground, a vehicle was reversing, fast, driver not checking, directly into the path she was walking into. Hanul was out of the car before he had decided to be out of the car. This was the part he could never explain afterward, not to Yona, not to himself, not to the driver who sat in the black car and watched it happen with his mouth open. He had not thought about it. His body had simply moved, the way his body moved in the training courtyard, with the specific efficiency of a system that had been trained to respond and had never lost the ability to respond even when everything else had been taken from it. 4 strides across the footpath and his hand closed around the back of the girl's collar, and he pulled her back and the car passed through the space she had been occupying. The driver accelerated away, oblivious. The sound of the engine faded down the road. Hanul stood on the footpath with his hands still closed around the back of a 5-year-old's collar and looked down at her. She looked up at him. He had expected fear. Children who were grabbed unexpectedly by strangers were afraid. This was how it was supposed to work. This was the appropriate response. She was not afraid. She was looking up at him with large dark eyes that were doing the thing eyes did when they were looking at something they were trying to classify, and she was not afraid, and this surprised him, and the surprise of it made him look at her more carefully than he had intended to. Her jaw. He did not know what to do with this observation. He looked at her jaw and then looked away from it because looking at it produced the frequency, stronger than it had ever been, strong enough that he actually felt it physically, a resonance in his chest like something calling to something, and the frequency produced nothing he could hold on to and everything his body seemed to want to respond to. 어디 보고 다니는 거야? He said. You should watch where you are going. His voice came out more gently than he intended. The girl looked at him. She arranged her expression into one of complete seriousness, the seriousness of a 5-year-old who has decided a moment deserves gravity, and she said, 고맙습니다, 선생님. Thank you, great sir. He set her down. She ran to the bus. He stood on the footpath and watched the bus pull away from the gate and into the street, and he kept watching it until it had turned the corner and disappeared, and even then he did not move immediately. The frequency was everywhere now. Not fading. Not receding back to the manageable background hum it usually settled into after one of these episodes. It was present and loud and producing nothing he could reach and everything he could feel, and he stood on the footpath outside a school and breathed and tried to find the edges of it and couldn't. In the car, his driver was waiting. He got back in. He sat in the back seat. The driver said nothing because the driver had learned that silence was the correct response to the things that happened to Hanul that Hanul could not explain. From the glove compartment, Hanul took the small white pill case. He opened it. He held the pill for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than he usually held it, and he swallowed it and leaned back against the headrest and closed his eyes. The frequency faded. The world resettled into the shape he knew. But her eyes stayed with him. The jaw stayed. The voice stayed 고맙습니다, sensing him with its gravity and its complete absence of fear. He carried all of it home and set it down in the part of himself where the medication could not fully reach, and it sat there in the dark, waiting. Patient as everything true is patient. That evening, Jun Hai went to the boot of his car and stood there for a long time with his hand on the lock. Inside, the assault rifle. He had not used it in 3 years. His hands had not forgotten it. Hands never forgot things that mattered, which was either a comfort or a warning depending on which hands and which things. He thought about Ryan. He thought about Yona's face when she said "Kaga Nemenja." That is your problem. He thought about Hayan at the playground with the clip in the wrong place talking to a boy twice her size with total authority. He thought about what 1 week meant in the vocabulary of a man like Ryan. He closed the boot without opening it. He went upstairs. He made dinner. He sat with Rachel and Hayan and he listened to Hayan describe her day. The boy at the playground, the teacher who had said something funny, the drawing she had done that she wanted to show him, and he listened to all of it with the full attention it deserved and more, because he was trying to memorize it the way you memorize things you are afraid of losing. After Hayan was in bed and Rachel was reading on the couch, Junhai stood at the kitchen window and looked at Seoul and made his decision. He went back down to the car. He opened the boot. He went back up through the building the way he had always gone, through the service route, the one whose code Yona had never changed because she had never believed he would actually use it for this. The code was 6 digits he had memorized 3 years ago in the context of a completely different kind of work, when he was a completely different kind of man, or at least a man who had not yet understood the difference between the man he was and the man he was capable of being. The door opened. He went up the stairs. The building was quiet at this hour, the specific quiet of expensive buildings at night, where the walls are thick enough to swallow everything. He found Yona on the top floor at the window. Always at the window. She had a particular relationship with glass and height and the city below, as if Seoul were something she needed to keep watching to make sure it stayed in its place. She turned when she heard him and she looked at the rifle and she did not flinch, because Yona did not flinch, because flinching was a concession and she did not make concessions. Jinaga, she said. His name. Just his name, in the tone of a woman who is managing something she anticipated. 내려놔. Put it down. 하은이를 지켜줘야 해요. He said. You need to protect Haeun. 지금 당장. Right now. 그 얘기는 이미 끝났어. That conversation is finished. 아직 안 끝났어요. It is not finished. She looked at him. He looked at her. The rifle was in his hands and his hands were steady, and Yona read this and made a calculation and arrived at a conclusion that she had been wrong before and was wrong again now, which was that Junhai's love for Rachel was a leash and leashes could be held. She had not accounted for what love becomes when it is also love for a child. It becomes something that does not have a leash. It becomes the most dangerous version of itself. He raised the rifle. He never fired it. Hanul moved from the doorway of the adjoining room where he had been standing, which Junhai had not known, could not have known, because the medication had made Hanul's footsteps something the medication could not take, which was absolutely silent. He crossed the room in the time between one breath and the next, and the blade was already in his hand, and the first bullet deflected off the flat of it with a sound like a hammer on a bell, and the second deflected, and the third. And then Hanul's arm was around Yona, and they were moving backward, and the window was behind them, and Junhai watched it happen the way you watch things that are too fast to process in real time in fragments. In the gaps between frames, the glass spider webbing from. The impact of Hanul's shoulder, then the two of them going through it together, then the absence where they had been standing. Then the sound from 9 floors below of a car roof receiving them. He went to the window. The car below was destroyed, roof compressed, glass exploded outward in a perfect circle, both of them already moving in the wreckage before it had stopped rocking. Hanul pulled Yona to her feet. She was already running. He was already beside her. They went into the city and Seoul received them without comment, and they were gone. Junhai stood in the broken window frame with glass around his feet and Seoul below him and understood what he had set in motion. He could not unmake it. The only direction left was forward. He made 2 calls. The first was to Miho. The second was to Ryan. The call to Ryan cost him more than the call to Miho. Ryan was not interested in Junhai's explanations or his context or the 5 years of backstory he offered as a way of establishing that his motives were not entirely self-serving. Ryan was interested in one thing. 하네 우리 살아있어? Is Hanul alive? Junhai closed his eyes. 네, 있어. A silence. The specific silence of a man receiving information he has been operating without for 5 years and recalibrating everything in light of it. 어디 있어? Where is he? 예나가 데리고 있어요. 하지만 세뇌됐어요. Yona has him. But he has been conditioned. Another silence. Longer this time. Helgi Benolga, Ryan said finally. I will send the helicopter. 배에서 만나. Meet me at the ship. He paused. 하네오를 데려와. Bring me my nephew. The call ended. Junhai put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the city one more time from the broken window. Then he left. Rachel was awake when he got home. She was in the kitchen with tea that had gone cold, which meant she had been sitting there long enough for it to cool, which meant she had been awake and waiting and doing the specific kind of thinking that produces cold tea. She looked at him when he came through the door and her eyes did the rapid assessment they always did, taking him in, reading him, arriving at conclusions faster than most people arrived at observations. 뭔 일이야? She said. What happened? He sat down across from her. He put his hands on the table. He looked at them for a moment. 레이첼, he said. 해야 할 말이 있어. There is something I need to tell you. She looked at him. 다 말할게. 지금 당장은 시간이 없어. 하지만 다 말할게. 약속해. I will tell you everything. Right now there is no time. But I will tell you everything. I promise. She looked at him for a long time with the eyes she used when she was deciding how much to trust an incomplete answer. Then she said, 지금 당장 뭐가 일어나고 있는 거야? What is happening right now? 하은이를 데려가려는 사람들이 있어. He said. There are people coming for 혜연. 오늘 밤 막을 수 있어. 하지만 같이 가야 해. I can stop it tonight. But you have to come with me. She stood up without hesitation. 하은이는 민호한테 맡겼어. Miho has her. 안전해. She is safe. Rachel looked at him one final time. Then she went for her jacket. They came for the child anyway. Yona had anticipated the helicopter. She had anticipated Ryan and she had anticipated Junhai's call and she had understood, from the moment the window broke and she and Hanul hit the car roof and the city swallowed them, that the variables had multiplied past the point where patience was still a viable strategy. She was done with patience. Patience was what you employed when you had time. She did not have time. She told Hanul, Rachel Pisire. Rachel Fizeo. 그리고 아이도. And the child. 데려와. Bring them to me. He looked at her. The medication was still managing his compliance, still suppressing the pathways that would have produced the question he needed to ask, still maintaining the constructed reality in which this instruction made sense and was acceptable. Ew, he said. A question. Small. The first real question he had asked her in months. The medication had not fully suppressed the part of him that asked questions. It had tried. The frequency from the school footpath had been making the medication work harder for 3 days. 하네울. Her voice, using his name, with the specific weight she applied when she needed him to stop processing and simply respond. 지금 당장. Right now. He went. He came for them at night. The apartment had 2 guards. Junhai had stationed them after the arrow. They did not stop Hanul. They had not been told to expect him. More importantly, they had not been trained for him. He moved through them the way weather moves through things, without argument, without warning, and when it was done he went through the apartment door. Rachel heard the guards go down. She was already reaching for Hayan, already pulling her daughter from the bed and holding her against her chest, when the bedroom door opened. She pressed herself against the far wall with Hayan in her arms, and she looked at the man in the doorway and the world tilted. Because she knew that jaw. She knew those tattoos. She knew the specific way he occupied a doorway, the complete lack of self-consciousness about the space his presence consumed. Haneul. She said it before she could stop herself. His name in her mouth, after 5 years of it living only in the part of her she didn't visit often. Haneul, 나 봐봐. Look at me. Nah. It's me. He looked at her. His face gave her nothing. Nah, she said again softer. The softness was not weakness. It was precision, the specific register she was reaching for. 기억 안 나. Don't you remember? 같이 가야 해요. You need to come with me. His voice, even professional, the voice of a man executing an instruction. She looked at his eyes. She had always been good at reading eyes, had built her understanding of people on what she found in them, and what she found in his was the most specific kind of grief she had ever seen, the grief of something that knows it is lost without knowing it is looking to be found. He was there and not there. Alive and not himself. Breathing and absent. She held Hayan tighter. Hayan looked at the man in the doorway. She looked at him the way she had looked at him on the school footpath, with the eyes that did not carry fear, that carried instead the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was trying to classify. She had not said anything. She was still looking. They were taken to the ship. The industrial port on the eastern edge of the city, the part of Seoul that belonged to the underworld's logistics rather than the city's beauty. The ship was enormous and dark and smelled of salt water and iron and the particular cold of a structure that has been sitting in deep water long enough to absorb it. Hanul brought them below deck and stationed himself above, and Seoul disappeared behind the water and the dark. Junhai tracked them by the signal on Rachel's phone. The helicopter appeared above the ship as the first gray light of morning hit the water. Ryan's helicopter, 2 of them in fact, the second hanging back while the first descended. Junhai came down the rope before it had fully stopped moving and landed on the deck hard enough to feel it in his knees, and looked up and Hanul was already there. 2 swords, both drawn. The eyes of a man who had been given a specific instruction and had not yet found a reason sufficient to override it. They looked at each other across the deck in the gray morning light. Hanul, Junhai said. 물러서. Stand back. 들어봐. 제발. Listen. Please. Hanul moved. The first exchange was fast enough that Junhai barely got his forearm up in time, the blade grazing him across the wrist and drawing blood immediately, and he stepped back and reset and Hanul came again, and the second exchange went to the deck railing before Junhai managed to find an angle that bought him 2 seconds of space. 그녀 이름이 레이첼이야. Her name is Rachel. He said it in the 2 seconds he had bought himself. 레이첼 피사요. 드래곤즈 브레스에서 바텐더였어. She was a bartender at Dragon's Breath. He barely got the sentence out before Hanul was on him again, and he deflected and stepped and kept talking because talking was the only thing he had and he was going to use it until his body stopped working. 내 손에 붕대를 감아줬어. She bandaged your hand. Another exchange. Another deflection. The blood from his wrist was making his grip unreliable. 칼날을 맨손으로 잡았잖아. 그녀한테 닿지 않으려고. You caught a blade barehanded so it wouldn't touch her. Something happened in Hanul's face. Small. Fast. Like a shadow crossing clear water. Gone before it settled. Junhai kept going. 병원 복도에서 칼을 대신 맞았잖아. You stepped in front of a sword on a hospital corridor floor. 피를 흘리면서 마지막으로 한 말이 뭔지 알아? Do you know what the last thing you said was? He blocked the next swing and felt the impact all the way to his shoulder. 미안해. 내 사랑. I'm sorry. My love. The blade slowed. Not stopped. But slowed. 배 아래에 있는 아이. Junhai said. The child below this deck. 5살이야. She is 5 years old. He was breathing hard now. Blood from his wrist dropping onto the deck with each heartbeat. 5년 동안 날 아빠라고 불렀어. 내가 거기 있었고 내가 없었으니까. She has called me daddy for 5 years because I was there and you were not. 그건 내 잘못이야. That is my fault. 하지만 그 아이가 내 턱을 가졌어. But she has your jaw. The blade stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. 사흘 전에 학교 앞에서 차에 치일 뻔한 아이가 있었어. 3 days ago at a school there was a girl about to be hit by a car. 내가 구했잖아. You saved her. 내가 잡았잖아. You grabbed her. 선생님 고맙습니다 라고 했던 아이. The one who said thank you, great sir. 그게 내 딸이야. That was your daughter. 내가 내 딸을 구하고도 몰랐던 거야. You saved your own daughter and you did not know. The deck went quiet. Then Yona arrived. She came down from the upper deck with Rachel and Han in front of her, one hand on Rachel's arm, moving them toward the stern railing with the controlled urgency of someone who has read the situation correctly and is executing the contingency she had been hoping not to need. The dark port water was below the railing. Seoul was behind them. Ryan's helicopters were above them. Haneul. She called to him across the deck. Her voice was the voice she used when she needed compliance immediately, the specific frequency she had calibrated over 5 years to produce the response she required. Tuka. Kill them. 둘 다. Both of them. 그러면 집에 가는 거야. And then we go home. Jun-hai stepped toward her. She raised the gun and shot him. Not to kill. She was precise about these things, had always been precise about these things, precision being the quality she most respected in herself and most relied on in others. The bullet caught him in the side and the impact sent him backward into the stern railing and over it, and he was hanging above the black water by one hand, his body swinging against the hull, the gun gone into the dark below him. He hung there, his hand on the wet railing, his feet above water. He thought about letting go. He thought about it for a full second. Then he held on. Because Hayan called him Appa, and because Rachel had trusted him with more than he deserved, and because you do not let go when there are still things you owe the world. He held on. On the deck, Hanul looked at Rachel. He looked at Hayan. He looked at Yona. He looked at the blade in his hand, and his hand was shaking, and it had never shaken. Not once. Not in 15 years of this. Not in any training session or any real encounter. Not when the adrenaline was highest or the stakes were clearest. His hands had always been the steadiest part of him, and they were shaking now, and the shaking was not weakness. Yona said again, Jagur. Kill them. Rachel did not plead. She had never pleaded. She looked at him, directly, completely, the way she had looked at him the very first night across a first aid kit in a soul club, the look that had nothing performed in it, that was simply her entire self turned toward him without any protection between them, and she said 2 words. In Korean. Quietly. With the weight of something she had been carrying for a long time. 언제나 영원히. Always and forever. The world went silent on the deck of that ship. Hanul's body stopped moving. These were the words his parents had said to each other every day. His mother's voice, his father's response, the specific music of those 4 syllables in the air of a home he had not been inside in 21 years, a home he had not been allowed to remember, had been chemically prevented from accessing, had been cut off from in every deliberate and systematic way that Yona's money and Yona's doctors could devise. And here they were. In Rachel's voice. In Rachel's accent. In the mouth of a woman who had learned them from Miho 3 years after a funeral and kept them without knowing exactly why and used them now without knowing exactly if they would work, on a ship deck at dawn with port water below and helicopters above and a 5-year-old girl watching from beside the railing. The dam broke. Not gradually. Not in stages. All at once, the way dams actually break. Total structural failure at every point simultaneously. 5 years of constructed reality dissolving in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He saw Dragon's breath. The club. The music. Her moving through the crowd with the tray and the hair and the laugh that cost her nothing. He saw himself watching her and not approaching because he knew what he did to everything he touched. He saw the man with the sword and his own hand closing around the blade and the blood, and then her sitting across from him with the first aid kit saying Matsumidan and Chimbuna. He saw the BMW in the rain. He saw the penthouse. He saw the morning. He saw the office and the check and the way she had torn it in half and the sound of it. He saw the corridor and the floor and her hands pressing on the wound and her face above him and the words he had managed in the end, the only true words he had ever said to her. He saw the school footpath. The girl in the uniform. The clip in the wrong place. The jaw that his hands had recognized before his mind could. 고맙습니다, 선생님. The eyes. Her eyes. Rachel's eyes in a face that was also his face, that had always been his face, that he had looked at, and the medication had suppressed the recognition every time, but the body had known. The body had always known. The body had been trying to tell him for 3 days, and he had swallowed a pill and told it to be quiet. He was back. Not all the way. Not yet. There would be time for all the way. But enough. Enough to know exactly where he was and who was in front of him and what Yona was asking him to do. Yona said it one final time, Jagur. He looked at her. He looked at her with the full recognition of a man who has been somewhere terrible for a long time and has just found the door. His face did not show rage. It showed something quieter. Something more absolute. He turned the blade. He drove it through his own side. Through the scar, exactly through the scar, the place the first blade had gone on a hospital corridor floor 5 years ago when he had stepped in front of it because he would not let it reach her. The same place. The same choice. The same man. The pain of it was total and clarifying, and it broke the last thread of Yona's hold because there is nothing. No medication, no conditioning, no 5-year construction of manufactured identity that reaches past a man who stabs himself to stop himself from becoming the thing that hurts the person he loves. He went to one knee. He did not fall. He went to one knee deliberately, the blade in the deck beside him, and he looked at Rachel, and his eyes were his eyes and nothing else, and she saw it. She saw him come back into them, and she made a sound that was not crying and not relief and not grief, but all of those things at once. The specific sound of a person who has been holding something for so long that putting it down feels like falling. Then Heian walked across the deck to him. Nobody told her to. Nobody prompted her. She walked across the deck of that ship in her school uniform. She had been wearing it since yesterday morning when Hanul had come for them, and there had been no time for anything else, and she stood in front of him where he was kneeling, and she put her small hand on his face. She said nothing. She simply put her hand on his face and looked at him with those eyes, his jaw, Rachel's eyes, the whole of both of them compressed into one small person who had been alive for 5 years and had been his for all of them without knowing it, and looked at him the way she had looked at him on the school footpath, with the quality of attention that did not carry fear, that simply saw. His hands came up. Both of them. He covered her small hand with both of his, and he held it against his face, and he closed his eyes. 5 years. He had been gone for 5 years. She had been alive for 5 years. He had missed every single day of it, and the weight of that was immense and specific, and he held it completely, right there on the deck, with her hand in his and Rachel above them, and Soul somewhere behind the water, and the morning coming up gold over everything. Ryan's second helicopter descended. Ropes dropped. Men dropped. Yona, at the railing where Rachel had pushed her, hit the water below without a sound, and the water received her, and Ryan's men were already moving to recover her, because Ryan had plans for Yona that were considerably less final than drowning, a living Yona being more useful than a dead one for the specific kind of justice the clan intended to administer. Junhai was pulled up from the railing. He collapsed on the deck. Rachel went to him. He looked up at her and opened his mouth, and she said nothing. Later. He closed his mouth. He held her hand. He was alive, and he owed her a conversation that was going to be the hardest conversation of his life, and he intended to have it, every word of it, as soon as he was able to stand. The clan courtyard was in the coldest and most beautiful part of Seoul, the elevated northern quarter where the city dropped away below you, and the air was clean enough to taste, and the stone of the old buildings carried the cold in a way that made everything feel permanent, like it had been standing long before any of the people in it and would be standing long after. The clan members stood in rows, dozens of them in black, facing forward, completely still with the stillness of people who understand exactly what a moment means and have been waiting for it. 5 years of a second master. 5 years of an absence nobody was allowed to name. 5 years of running something that belonged to someone else and knowing it and maintaining it anyway, because the alternative was dissolution. Hanul walked in last. Royal Hanbok, deep black with gold at the collar and cuffs, the clan's dragon embroidered at the chest in thread, so dark it was only visible when the light moved across it. Short ponytail. Some hair falling forward across his jaw. The scar beneath the fabric. The tattoo above the collar. In his right hand, the blade, point down, carried the way you carry something that is yours rather than something you're performing with. To his left, Rachel Fizeo. Royal Hanbok in deep red with gold detail, her long straight hair down around her shoulders, her face doing the thing her face always did, completely present, completely composed, entirely herself. The woman who had walked into a Seoul nightclub 14 months before any of this began and sat across from a dangerous man with a first aid kit and the specific audacity of someone who has never once let fear decide anything for her. She looked like she had always belonged here. She also looked exactly like herself, which was the same thing. To his right, Heian. Royal Hanbok in gold and cream. Hair in 2 perfect puffs that her mother had done this morning for the first time in 2 days, and that were therefore exactly right. Holding her father's hand with both of hers. She had not let go since the ship. She was not going to let go now. She was 5 years old, and she was figuring out what to call him, and she had not yet decided, but she was working on it with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything that mattered, and when she decided she would tell him, and he would receive it with everything he had. The clan bowed. Together. One motion, one sound, the collective acknowledgement of a man returned. Dragon, they said. Dragon. Mujok. Invincible. Hanul looked at them. He looked at all of them, at the rows of people who had kept this structure intact for 5 years against the gravity of his absence, who had served under a second master rather than dissolve, who had understood that what he represented was worth waiting for. Then he looked left. Rachel looked back at him with the full history of everything in her eyes. Dragon's breath and the BMW and the check and the corridor and 5 years of a grief she had carried without putting down in 2 words on a ship deck at dawn, and his eyes coming back to themselves, and she did not look away. He looked right. Han looked up at him with those eyes. His jaw. Her mother's eyes. The whole of both of them. He placed the sword point first into the stone of the courtyard floor. He released it. It stood on its own, upright, still, the dragon on the blade catching the morning light. He reached out both hands. One found Rachel's. One found Han's. The three of them stood in the cold and the silence and the gold soul morning, and it was not perfect. There was too much water under this bridge for perfect, too much that had been lost and taken and spent and grieved. But it was real. It was theirs. It had always been going to be theirs. They had simply needed to survive long enough to reach it. Hold on them. All three. The sword in the stone. The dragon catching the light. Ondena yomoni. Always and forever. Smash to black. If this story broke you the way it was built to, hit the like button right now. Drop in the comments the single moment that wrecked you most, and subscribe with notifications on because the people who create stories like this one deserve to know you are here. The dragon returned. The sword is in the stone. And some stories, when they are told exactly right, stay with you forever. Ondena yomoni.